Hey everyone, I am Adam Forziati. I'm a contributing writer here at Fragrantica, and I've got my friend and fellow contributor with me, Nicola Thomis, on the line to talk about a few smoky perfumes that we really enjoy. But before we get into any of that, I do have some very intriguing math to share, and I promise you, Nicola, it's like exciting math. So, okay, if you read our joint article, which we have, about smoky perfumes that we recently published on Fragrantica, that you will know both Nicola and I sometimes feel like smoke can be a little aggressive, especially in like the Indian niche markets or fields of fragrance. And is that kind of where you stand generally, Nicola? If you had to just have like a single takeaway from where that area of the market lies?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, I think sometimes people just go a little bit heavy on it. Not always though, because there's some. I think we're going to talk about some beautiful scents tonight.
I think so. But I was just sort of curious to know if like we could assign anything more, let's say, quantitative about that assessment, other than our own personal observations of the many scents we've smelled in the smoky realm. Just like a way to really statistically quantify the overuse of smoke and fragrances. And it turns out that one can do this theoretically. So I made the point in the article that humans are just really good at identifying smoke anywhere, not just in fragrances. Our noses can pick out smoke in terms of parts per million. So even just like the faintest whiff of it in the atmosphere. So that's called the odor detection threshold of smoke. And in humans, that threshold is 5 parts per million or less. So that's an alarmingly like intense sensitivity that we have to anything that smells like smoke, which I guess biologically makes sense, both for incoming food, cooked food, or danger. So if we think about a perfume's formula, usually the numbers are pretty round. I know from experience of blending my own things, but also from studying the work of others that a first draft of a fragrance is often done at like 10 grams before adding any perfumer's alcohol or diluting. So that way it can be easily scaled up and just sort of brought up if the perfumer thinks it's ready for release. So a 10-gram formula. I know from surveys and accords and perfume formula examples that I've seen that smoke materials are, blatantly smoky materials, that is, are often used at less than 1% of a formula, sometimes only 0.1% out of a 10-gram formula. So that's 1% of that. If we convert zero point 0.1 in 10 grams to parts per million, that equals 10,000 parts per million. Again, we can smell smoke at 5 parts per million. But I guess, what if we even go a bit further and say, like, let's say it's 0.01% of a formula that a blatantly smoky material is used. That's still 100 parts per million, far above what our noses are capable of smelling, in terms of odor detection threshold. So why am I throwing all these numbers out? I guess I just wanted to make the point that, indie perfumers especially, but certainly not the only, realm of fragrance to do this, they seem to use way more smoky materials than they might need to in a blend to kind of get the point across. Of course, once you start throwing a ton of other materials in there and the more materials you throw, the more obscured that smoke might become. But, you know, certainly not all other materials in a blend are going to be the same level of intensity as a smoky material, let's say. So I recognize that. But, I just wanted to make the point that sometimes fragrance fragrances can use smoke like a club, and I know that you and I, Nicola, are going to talk today about some smoky scents that we referenced in that article that use it less like a bat or a club and more like, a swift baton. With that in mind, let's get into it. Nicola, can you tell me a little bit about what you typically enjoy in smoky scents?
Yeah, so I like smoke when it has a sweet element quite often. So when that kind of really aggressive edge is toned down with some sweetness, and actually, by the fireside, Maison Margiela is a nice example of that. Very wearable, very popular example that I love to wear in the autumn and winter. Um, and I also love smoke when it has a kind of white light feel about it. So quite often when there's a white incense, Um, I really like that. I like churchy fragrances. I like scents that smell purifying, and I find that quite relaxing. Um, so those are definitely the types of smoke that if I see those in a notes list or a fragrance description, my ears kind of prick up and I think, right, I'm gonna smell that because it does sound like it might be up my street.
Yeah, I think you and I align perfectly there. Some of the best examples of smoky perfumes that I can think of, particularly in the niche and indie categories, are they're always paired with something a little, for lack of a better term, sweet. But coumarin is something that comes to mind. That's a commonality in some of the smokier scents that I've loved. That they combine it with this aggressive but still somewhat sweetened dose of coumarin, and it, because the relative sweetness kind of tames the edges. Something that is also, relevant there is that, the length that the materials stay on skin is important. So like when you think about a perfume's formula, you have like those fleeting top notes, the kind of middle of the road, in terms of their longevity, middle notes, and then the base notes of a fragrance are the things that stay on the skin the longest, of course. And those things, can be subdivided into a million different categories of length that they'll stay on skin. When we think about base notes, that's base, middle, and top, we're talking about a very deconstructed, simplified, view of like how relatively long materials last. But in terms of base notes, some might last a few hours, and then some can last for over a day on skin, that is, and longer on paper. So when you think about smoky materials, they tend to last quite a long time on paper and on skin. And you need to pair those things, those materials, those smoky materials with, behaviored materials, things that will last just as long, if not longer, than the smoky materials themselves, which can be challenging to do because the longer, the longer life on skin and paper that you're seeking in your materials, like the fewer options you tend to have.
Mm.
So that's something that's really important to me, is that a fragrance, you know, it masks or improves the quality of smoke with materials that also match smoky materials behavior a little bit.
Yeah.
And I know several of the perfumes mentioned in my section of the article that we wrote together, that we will link in the description, of course, kind of pulls that strategy. So, Nicola, do you want to jump right into just a quick overview of some of the main choices that you had, and then I know
Yeah.
we're going to dive a little deeper into some of the more not obscure, but some of the honorable mentions that we had there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, my first pick was Santa Incienso Silage Sacra by the Different Company, which is definitely playing to that white, purifying, incense type smoke, but it also couples it with that idea of white light. It's very crisp, I find, but very, very soothing. And it is a very tenacious perfume. It does last for a good long while, but I never find that it's particularly obtrusive, even though it is smoky. Um, it just makes me feel very sort of put together and crisp and, um, yeah, I really like it. It's got a friendly side to it too. And then I picked A Flame in Your Heart by 4160 Tuesdays, which is a real sweet smoke. It's really chewy and resinous and lovely and sort of unctuous. Again, very long lasting. Um, very cozy winter scent. It's got a kind of burnt match accord or feel about it. That I just love. That kind of, you just lit a candle and you blow the match out and you get that gorgeous smell. That's very much part of that fragrance, and yeah, again, lasts really well. Just really nice to wear. So yeah. What about you, Adam? Which were your three and why?
I had two, and my as my main selections for this article, and the first one was by an American brand, an independent brand called Chatillon Lux. They were based out of St. Louis. The perfumer has a separate brand just named after his name, sort of a different project, just called Sean Mayer. Uh, and the fragrance I chose was Admiral. And Admiral is named after an old, like, sort of steam ship that was patrolling the Mississippi River for a number of years. I think it still is. And the idea of the composition was that it wanted to really kind of change, a smoky accord into something treated, insofar as the smoke coming out of the back of the ship is not just, the type of wood burning fire smoke that you would assume, that you would associate with the word smoke. And I really like that kind of transference of like meaning and into something different than what you would expect from just the note of smoke, because I have this sort of, you know, perfume curiosity fantasy of like wanting to smell more perfumes that use smoke in very, very different ways, that use smoke to communicate, different uh, or stress different elements of what smoke smells like. It's not just a charred woodiness. It's not just a coal like quality. It's not just like that scratchy, hits the back of your sinuses kind of texture. It can be many different things. It can be a candle blown out. It can be, a room where smokers used to frequent. It could be so many things. And I really love when fragrances explore those like ancillary elements of this note. And this is a perfect example of that. And it has its own unique smoke accord, but it's also very, aromatic as a fragrance. It combines with notes of lemongrass and some florals, and it creates a very solar effect, a very springtime, summertime kind of association, which you don't really smell with smoky materials very often. And so that was in and of itself genius. The smoke accord is quite original and unique. And not only that, it somehow seemingly or seamlessly blends smoky and very deeply herbal notes with aquatics. And that was a very interesting effect in and of itself as well. And my other choice was the Cobra and Canary by Imaginary Authors. I think this was a little bit more plain to the point of this prompt. But I think I said before about how I like it when scents smell like not just the note, but the note as it has been in a place. So in this case, Cobra and Canary reminds me of the smell of a casino. And that's usually not a good thing. Usually not something I want to put on my skin. Um, I don't know if if anybody's watching this, if you've ever been at a casino before, they're not always the most pleasant smelling environments, but they are a little bit nostalgic insofar as I think cigarette smoke can be nostalgic. And there's certainly a slight hint of that here, but it done again in a way where, you know, it's removing those acrid parts and removing those kind of sickly elements of not only smoke, but like the environment that I'm describing, and then replacing it with soft musk and in this case, some hay and, tobacco flower notes. And, Josh Meyer, the perfumer for this brand, has such a way of just imbuing an element of fantasy and an element of like atmospheric sort of longing or, again, a little bit nostalgic. He has sort of a way with that in his fragrances. It's sort of hard to pin down. But you smell something like Cobra and Canary, you smell Memoirs of a Trespasser. It just has like a dreamy, kaleidoscopic, but still focused quality. And I really appreciated that about not just the smoke accord, but the composition as a whole from the Cobra and Canary. Uh, so those were our main choices for the article. But Nicola, I think there's value in us sort of diving more into our ancillary choices here.
I found that there was a lot of fragrances I could choose from for my additional choices. And actually, there are so many smoky scents that to even get on the honourable mentions, it feels like the runners up, but actually these were other scents that I love just as much, but I couldn't put them all as my kind of top choices. So one of those is Rosarium by Angela Champagne, which I really love because it has that proper incense smell, but in Rosarium, it's tempered by a really nice resinous vanilla. And there's also a feel of old stone in there as well, which I really find utterly compelling. It's very calming and soothing and contemplative, along with Boswellia Scotia actually from Jorum Studio, which came out at the back end of last year, which I just love too. They're very sort of quiet, very tenacious scents both, but very quiet, very grounding, very thoughtful fragrances that feel like I don't know whether the formulas are simple for them both or not, but they feel like they would be. That there's not a lot of clutter, there's not a lot of noise. It's just very like yeah, soothing, quiet time. It makes me think of being in, a kind of an old stone building in the middle of the night on my own, and it's not spooky, it's protective and, just lovely. So there's that one. Now, I want to digress a little bit into this idea that I had whilst we were writing this article about the different types of smoke. So I am sort of developing this, vaguely half-baked theory that you've got white smoke incense, essentially, which is the smoke that smells like it might be um, on an autumn day. It might be that kind of incensey church smoke. Um, it's a sort of purifying smoke. Then you've got dark smokes. Um, and I'm just reminded of League of Gentlemen, and I saw them live, and they did a whole thing about how if you're from Hull, you say smirk, um, but that sort of it's a mucky smirk, which would be mucky smoke to anybody who's not from Hull, um, and it's things like cigarette smoke, um, that lingering scent that's in a building that used to be a smoking venue and now isn't. Sometimes bonfire smoke could fall into either of these categories, I think, as well. And then I think there's a third category as well, which is less prevalent and less obvious, but that's green smoke. Um, and what I mean by green smoke is if you imagine a pile of cuttings from a garden that somebody's then tried to put a match to. So it's that kind of smouldery, but it has a vegetal aspect as well, still a green aspect. Um, and one of the ones that I included in the article is Stelios from Pierre Guillaume. Another one would be Arborist from Jorum Studio, that both have that feel of it being not necessarily wood that's being it that's being set fire to, or resins that are being set fire to. Instead, it's kind of a wet or a wetter, damper, kind of more vegetal matter that's being set fire to. Do you think that covers? I mean, I think arguably there's a sort of fourth one as well, which is like a barbecue type smoke, which is a
Right.
smoke that would have a sort of savoury element to it. And I do think I find that most often, or I notice it most often in fragrances that use too much birch tar. Um, and I find birch tar a really interesting material because it's really, really nice smelling and really compelling. But if I have to wear a scent that's got too much of it in all day, by the end of the day, it really bugs me. And I have a real arc with it. Like I start, oh yeah, this is brilliant. I love this. By the end of the day, I'm just so exhausted by it that so yeah, maybe I'll include a sort of fourth category, which is barbecue smoke, but then scents that go a bit too barbecuey for me are they're not on my particular, you know, favorites. Would you say that's fair, Adam, or have I just gone off on a massive tangent?
No, no, I think that's completely fair. I tend to think of it's so tough because like we all have like different associations with these words. When you say green smoke, my mind goes initially to like, you know, green wood and like wood that's cut before it's primed, but burned anyway.
Mm.
But I think your analysis of it or your exemplary discussion of it works better. For me, the typical like campfire smoke sense, the super just acrid, just bold, just like big campfire smoke scents. Those are the fourth category
Mm.
for me. Um, but I can see if they're more well restrained, they can fit into other ones as well.
Yeah, yeah. So what when you look across your whole list, are you able to identify a category that appears more often?
Well, for the honorable mentions and the two spotlights, yeah. I think green smoke is more often. It's like maybe half or a good third of my selections. And then kind of difficult to say. I'll tell you what. I'll do like a little overview of some of my honorable mentions here that we wanted to talk about, and I can maybe separate them into two categories that I had in my brain, and then you can tell me which one they fit into your system. Um, so I had Indigo Smoke by Arquiste and Wendover from Clandestine Laboratories. To me, those two were more like the Cobra and Canary example, where the smoke is a little bit more obvious and it's more identifiably smoky insofar as you might think of, a fire, you might think of a candle being blown out. You might think of things that are more obviously smoky. And I say that just because Wendover itself is a really, it's got a high dose of smoky materials, but it's blended in such a way with coumarin and other agrestic choices that make it really well smoothed over and provides a necessary dose of sweetness and a floralcy and everything else. And I think that kind of avoids that bland, ashy, funky, extended dry down that a lot of these super high, fourth category smoky scents tend to have. And then Indigo Smoke from Arquiste, that's a tea perfume as well, but it's a very like Lapsang Souchong kind of like high smoke element to it. Uh, the way that it hides and sort of not hides, but sort of reanimates or configures that smoky smell is through the use of like a fruit, like an apricot fruity smell. And it's just brilliant. It's so gorgeous. And the cool thing about that one is that it's not too fruity because it's also smoky. And it's not too smoky because it's also fruity. And it's just in that in-between space that makes it very like toothsome and moorish.
Mm.
Uh, and in the dry down, there's a good, you know, decent dose of coumarin, I believe, as well. So that kind of also smooths it over. The other two were Noir Akume from Pierre Guillaume, which you and I have talked about at length, and Hierophante from Parfums Cortana. Now, Noir Akume is like another tea perfume, but really glossy, and it's kind of like tobacco-y almost. It's got like a dark ebony wood kind of accord that's just generally a polished, dark, slightly sweet, but also grainy, woody note.
Mm.
That kind of raises everything else and raises a smoke accord, raises a tea accord into new heights. And I really can't think of any other perfume that smells like it. And then Hierophante is doing that thing like Noir Akume, where it just takes smoke and completely explodes it.
Mm.
It's a different type of smoke altogether. This smoke is, sort of referring to like gasoline smoke and engine exhaust and fumes, kind of like a Dior Fahrenheit, but it softens that note. It adds a very tame, uh, like purring leather, and adds some coumarin and smoky, not smoky, sorry, soapy musks that smooth everything over and make it surprisingly friendly given its inspiration. So, you know, I have two types of smoky perfumes there. I don't know how well or how well they fit into your categories, but I kind of tend to see, that indigo smoke and Wendover as like that meteor, that fourth category that you described,
Mm.
and I see Noir Okume and Aerofante as, I guess, more green smoke, for lack
Mm.
of a better term.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're probably right there. It does sort of fit, doesn't it? I was just looking down my list and there's a couple that I didn't mention in the article, but which I subsequently thought about and thought, yeah, they're actually also really good. So I did include Architects Club by Arquiste for the smoky vanilla. So you've got that smoke with the sweetness, but it's not particularly dirty, but it's very interesting. I just love that perfume. I've talked about it before, but it's one that I just genuinely wear all the time because it's so nice and it just fits for so many different occasions. Fat Electrician by Etat Libre d'Orange. I Now I struggle to wear this perfume, but I think it's fascinating. The chestnut opening is so appealing and so evocative of a kind of autumnal day. And then this sort of what they call a semi-modern vetiver wanders through the picture. Now, when I've smelt this on other people, particularly on men actually, I think it smells really pleasant, but on my skin, it smells like old cigarettes. And at first, going back to the, kind of birch tar annoys me. At first, that makes me feel well, I once had a fancy office job, where I had to go quite smart, and I wore this one day to the office, and all day I thought to myself, "I smell like I had a really good night out last night, and I'm still, sweating out the remnants of it." And I'm not sure that well, it's certainly not office appropriate, I don't necessarily think. It certainly wasn't up office appropriate for me, and the trouble with me wearing it is it goes really ashy, but on other people, it seems to go less ashy. But either way, it's a fascinating perfume and one that I'm glad to have smelt and worn. Um, Athanor by Mendita Rosa. That I would put in the green smoke because it has a sulphurous element. And, you say, "Oh, I'm gonna make this perfume smell of sulphur," and you think, "Well, it's gonna smell eggy and unpleasant," but actually, it's just handled so perfectly that that little seam of dirt, I suppose, or imperfection, for want of a better expression, just throws all the beauty in the scent forwards. And so you actually notice the beauty more because of that little bit of darkness, that little sulphury kind of element that's in the background. It's a really clever perfume. It's got a very significant price tag. I only have a sample of it, but I love it. And, if I won the lottery, it would be on my buy list for sure. Stelios, which we've talked about, is green. Arborist again, green smoke. Um, Cabaret Nocturne by Visitor Parfums. I think there's definitely a group of perfumes and perfumers that like to evoke that kind of nightclub, jazz club, some sort of gathering with live music where at one point there might have been cigarettes smoked or cigars or, you know, various cool things with long handles that people might have smoked at one point. That kind of haze hanging in the atmosphere. And Cabaret Nocturne is one of those scents, but it handles it very beautifully and it still remains it's quite a sexy perfume, it's quite sultry, it's quite, yeah, nighttime wear, but it doesn't veer too mucky. Um, but I think there is a seam of those scents which you could almost explore in their own right if you wanted to, that kind of club feel. I think, Schwarzlose do one called Rausch, which is very, very smoky kind of techno club. And there are others besides, I'm sure. And then I kind of went on to think about Tartan, Sarah Baker, smoky whiskey casks. And I know they've just done a special edition, which is like uber smoky. And that one is, kind of smoke to the max, but with that kind of Scotch whiskey feel. And then somebody mentioned in the comments actually of the article, which I think is a great shout, Beaufort. And I can't believe I didn't sort of think of them at the time, but they'd make some fantastically smoky perfumes. Now, some of them really are full on smoky. Some of them are really, really more towards what you would call a smoky club, I guess. But they do them with such aplomb that I totally forgive them that, and some of their scents are such explorations of darkness and moodiness and historical settings and stuff that actually the smoke element works. It's absolutely bang on. Iron Duke is a great one. I think it's called Rake and Ruin is another. There's some Tonnerre, something like that. There's some really good. I think if you wanted to explore smoke in a brand, you could do worse than pick Beaufort and just dive into all their scents along that line. So yeah, and then yeah, Boswellia Scotia I mentioned briefly by Jorum. It's so calming and soothing and just generally a sort of happy sigh of a perfume, that I just really like to wear. It's one I quite like to wear to bed actually, 'cause, I do wake up in the night and think, "What's that lovely smell?" And I think, "Oh, yes, it's" and go back to sleep now.
I love that. It struck me while we were having this discussion that smoky perfumes are really kind of an extension of the idea of fragrances overall diversity
Mm,
and specifically as it pertains to people and like what we like to smell versus what we don't like to smell. We talked at the beginning of this discussion about how human noses are inclined to smell smoke at even the smallest of uh, you know parts per million. Um i it, it just sort of struck me that, like, when you bring any given fragrance, any of the hundreds of thousands that exist on the market today. Uh, you can show it to anybody and get wildly different results. Never mind how you feel about it specifically. And I think smoky perfume can elicit similarly uh, black and white response in people, where even if it's a fragrance that uses a little or a lot of it, um, that people can respond very differently to that and
mm,
have very different associations with that.
mm,
And, I just think that that's a fascinating kind of allegory for fragrance in general, which I never really stopped to think about. Like, smoke, sometimes you're tempted to think of it as a material and a chord in perfume that might not be so uh, easily bendable and so easily pliable. Like jasmine, for example, is an incredibly pliable fragrance. And the more jasmine fragrances you smell, the more you realize that it can be done in so many different ways.
mm,
Uh, it can be very John Claude Elena, classy, almost barely there, Hedionne like. And then it can also just be very skanky and very full on and very oily and everything in between, fruity even. And so, you know, that's a material that I think we tend to see as like the opposite of smoke, which tends to be very like it's there, it stays there for a long time, and it is what it is. But I think the more smoky perfumes that we discover, the more we're discovering that's not quite true.
yeah, and I think as well, I think it's really interesting, just picking up on something that you said earlier about personal associations with smoke, and I just wonder, have you got any smoke anecdotes? There's a pun in there somewhere that,
Smoke it.
I'm just wondering about times in your life when you have scent memories associated with smoke, if there's any of those that, like, really leap out and how they've ended up shaping your sort of feel of smoky perfumes.
Well, I grew up in New England, but specifically in the part that's like very close to the ocean, and I remain living in that kind of relative region of it. So, you know, first of all, I definitely associate like a seaside saltiness with smoke, just because I'm always kind of near that here.
When
But
Sorry to interrupt. When you were a kid, did because we sort of this is the sort of thing we see on American movies, but did you go to the beach with your friends and have a big bonfire and sit around and drink a keg of beer and somebody brought an acoustic guitar and then somebody was murdered in the sand dunes?
I was a very lame young adult, and I did not do that. I know people who did, so
Yeah.
that was around. I did, like, my fair share of, let's say, adolescent experimentations, but I did it in a very controlled way. Like I wasn't. It wasn't like my entire life. Like I wasn't, that kid. Um, and yeah, so not quite that. I didn't have that experience, but many people did around me, and more so, it's just like. Yeah, we also had a boat when I was a kid, and the smell of like the burning, specifically boat fuel,
Mm,
or the way that the same fuel runs through boats is different than it runs through cars, and it
mm,
gets like gurgled up in the water a little bit, and then you're smelling like this really pungent mix of like seawater, oceanic salt water, and like the exhaust of the boat. And that's a very specific scent that I've never smelled interpreted in perfume before
mm.
somehow. I feel like that's ripe for the picking for some indie creator who has had a similar experience. Um, I guess part of that is sort of referenced in one of my main choices for this article, the one from Chatillon Lux, but it that was a freshwater boat. This is different. Um, I, More so, I think my main association with the smell of smoke comes from, the first cold, properly cold night in the winter or late fall, where the air is very crisp and very pristine. And then you start to notice like somebody far off has a fire burning, and like that scent of like it slowly kind of taking over your nose when you're outside and it's very cold for the first time in that year. That's a very distinct smell. Maybe there's a
Mm.
bit of like leaf rot smell going on with that because by that point the leaves have almost certainly fallen.
Yeah.
um, so there's that kind of memory that you smell it and you get like hairs standing up on the back of your neck because it's
Mm.
very like you know that something has changed in the year,
Yeah.
and that's a powerful scent association I have. What about you?
Yeah, so something similar actually. My mum lives in a village, and that moment, the first cold night of autumn, everybody puts their log burners on, and the village just smells so delicious. It's gorgeous. It's such a nice smell. That warm smokiness, but coupled with the really crisp air. And then a sort of less sort of acceptable one is I had a very dear friend at university whose mum smoked like a chimney, and he used to wear a leather jacket, and he would go home at weekends to see his mum and sit in a living room where she was, smoking away. Smoking's not cool, everybody, it's not. And he'd come back smelling of this leather jacket that was sort of impregnated with the smoke, and it sounds awful, but it was actually really, really sort of nice and comforting, and I'd quite often go they were one of these families where it didn't matter, anybody was welcome, and you could always go and sit in their living room whenever you wanted, and, so I would quite often go home with him, and, I'd come back to uni, and, I didn't smoke at uni, and I've never smoked, and our halls, I think initially you could smoke in them actually, but then you couldn't later, but yeah, so I was never used to that smell of smoke being on my clothes, and so I would go and have a lovely weekend with him and his family, and then come back and have that sort of memory on my clothes, which was really weird. And then yeah, like kind of going to clubs and bars when I was very, very young, and you would go out and you'd have that kind of you'd go out and you'd get showered and you'd get washed and you'd put your perfume on and you'd make yourself look nice and you'd go out and you'd be in this miasma of smoke, and then the next day, that really horrible, stale smoke smell on your clothes, it's just like you had to wash everything. Um, and I remember when the smoking ban came inside in, the UK, and it was we were then treated to what the pubs actually smelled like when the smoke wasn't masking all the kind of funky carpet smells and stale beer. So yeah, it's a bit of a mixed bag really, but I don't think you can beat the first smell of smoke from wood burners or bonfires in the autumn. And yeah, of course, bonfire night for us too. It's a big deal when I was growing up to go and have a piece of parking and in the crisp air, and yeah, that sort of thing is lovely.
I I don't have anything that can maybe beat that scent, but I do have one thing that can rival it that I just thought of while you were talking about pubs. Um, when my wife and I went on our honeymoon in Ireland, we had to go to the Guinness factory. We like Guinness quite a bit, so we went. It was great. Don't let anybody ever tell you that. that the Guinness factory isn't worth a visit when you're in Dublin. Anyway, the scent outside of the directly outside of the Guinness factory, like when you get on the multi-layered bus and you leave the factory, that smell is I I want to bottle it so bad. Like never before have I wanted to bottle a scent as much as I fervently wanted to right outside there. Because it's not too far from the ocean. It's kind of right there. So you got the sea air smell mingling with like some smoky outcrops from the chimneys there from some of what they're doing. But also you have this insanely like colorful and complex scent of like the barley being like malted and
Mm.
sorry, let me remove the external sounds of this feline here making noise. Um, so it was like this really pungent like mix of different things, but mostly it's that like barley beer, but not stale beer. It's like
Mm.
pre-beer, proto beer smell
Mm.
that is almost a bit sweet, and that was one of the top 5 most incredible things I've smelled outside of fragrance, just sort of on plein air. That was incredible, and I really wish I could bottle it. It was indeed a bit smoky.
Yeah, super.
So I would love to encourage our viewers who are watching this who haven't read the Smoky Scents article yet to take a look if you want to go a little bit more in depth on these and other options. And the great thing about doing that is then you can very easily save those that you wish to explore onto your wish list or onto your to try list. So that's a benefit, a little plug for us there. And appreciate the time, Nicola. I love talking about scents with you because we always get to just sort of talk about everything other than fragrance as well.
Yeah, no, it's always great to talk to you, Adam. It's just like catching up down the pub, but with less smoky miasma in the air.